unemployment's now at a 20-year low, 3.5%. It is across the board. But if you're older, female, African-American, or those from marginalized groups, that 3.5% is closer to 9.5%. Because on average, for these groups, older, female, and African-American, the unemployment rate is typically 3 times the rate that it is for the average American. So we have to change that. And to change that requires us understanding from you some of the barriers. Because barriers are oftentimes what forces people to give up. And it's not just the unemployment numbers we're concerned about. There's something called the labor force participation rate. What is that? If you are 18 and over, and you are able to work, and you choose not to, or you opt out of the workforce, you are not captured in the unemployment numbers because you have left the workforce. And right now, the labor force participation rate for Americans is roughly in the high 60s, 60 to low 70%, which means roughly 28 to 30% of Americans who can work but have opted out the workforce are somehow not captured in the official numbers. So your experiences matter. Older Americans matter. Many of you have worked so hard to support your families and your communities. And all you are looking for is a little bit of help for a program designed for you to provide a pathway back into the workforce. So I applaud all of you today for being on this call. It's important for me to hear from you, but please know that every question you ask, I will respond to the best of my ability. And if I cannot do so, someone from my team will get back to you. So with that, I'd like to open up for questions.
If you are with us online today, you need to go to the bottom of your screen and select the Q&A button and type your question, or you can select the raise hand button and get in the queue to ask your question directly. If you joined us today by phone, hit *9 on your phone to get into the queue to ask your question directly. Thank you. Gary, while we wait for people to submit more questions, we do have some that people submitted in advance.
Yes.
And I think we'll start with one that a lot of people asked, which is about minimum wage. What is your organization doing to advocate for a higher minimum wage? I live in a state where the minimum wage is still $7.25 per hour, and I can't live on that amount.
First of all, we are, as a 501c3, we are not a political organization. So I can't go out and lobby individual members of Congress to support legislation to increase the minimum wage. What I can do is to speak to the challenges of the program, particularly in communities where the minimum wage is so low that it forces a competitive disadvantage for individuals to land positions that will enable them to support their families through the program. So we can do that, and there are networks for us to work through to advocate when necessary. But please keep this in mind. If the SCSEP program is not intended to be a long-term employment program, it's a program intended to provide our job seekers with the skills that they could use and hopefully skills with certifications that you can use to transition into higher paying jobs. I'm not referring to minimum wage jobs. I'm referring to higher paying jobs. So while in some case, while I can acknowledge the competitive disadvantage short term, I can also acknowledge that the training opportunity that SCSEP provides and the resume building opportunities that SCSEP will create will position you with time for jobs paying well above the minimum wage. So that's my answer. We will on the one hand, advocate through our colleagues and networks in the nonprofit and the advocacy community on this issue because it's important. It's important to you. That's why the question was asked. But at the same time, we have a responsibility, and you have a responsibility to use the program as a training opportunity to access the skills that you need to apply for jobs that will be out there. Next question.
From a caller, Maria Urek. And Maria, we're getting ready to open your line. So Maria, your line is open. If you'll please ask your question. Maria, your line's open. Can you hear us? Maria, we can't seem to hear you.
Let's go back to Maria if we can.
Okay. Our next caller is our project director from Montgomery County, Maryland, Kathy Nesterek. Kathy, your line is open. It looks, there you go.
Hi, sorry about that. It says I'm muted. Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay. I was curious because Gary, you mentioned providing, working on certification. Is there plans in SCSEP or in CWI to provide more job specific training with certification and more access to taking some of the tests and things that go with certifications?
That's a good question. So actually, there's two answers to that question. I think one, we are relying on you as our local partner to work with your job seeker to identify what kinds of training programs would work for them. And where possible, make those resources available to that job seeker, because we're passing these grants funds on to you to help tailor the training needs for individuals that you are serving. That's one. Second, we launched about a month ago something called our digital certification program. We recognize that, and our goal over the next 3 years is to help over 30,000 job seekers who qualify for SCSEP participate on an online virtual training program that will be staffed and supported, and resources will be allocated for it. And we're actively trying to bring other parties to the table. But we are going to launch a digital certification training program. And there will be components of that, which would include industry recognized credentials. Why is this important? What we found in the post-pandemic environment is that over 53% of jobs that are now being created, I read somewhere, would offer the opportunity for the employers to work in a hybrid environment. That means you have to know how to use Teams, Zoom. You have to know how to work with spreadsheets at a very modest level. You have to know the Microsoft platforms at a very modest level. And you'll be certified through the program to confirm your proficiency with these tools. And once you have these tools, you are now in a position where when you leave the SCSEP program, you can then inform a prospective employer that you have all the skills that's needed to be able and to be competent and to be proficient and to be fully engaged in the workforce based on what it is fast becoming. So digital competency is critical. We are going to have this program launched. We've announced it. It will be fully launched very shortly, but it's all geared towards getting people into positions where technology will drive the nature of the work they'll be asked to perform. Did I answer that question for you? I want to make sure.
Sorry, I'm down a hand. Yes, I am familiar with the CWI training, and I think that's a great foundational training. I was just curious about other certifications like intro to bookkeeping, HR, social services. We are working on getting some funding for those internally so that we can offer those to our SCSEP participants. But I was wondering if CWI was just planning to expand. Also, if we put them into programs, there's a lot of programs out there that will give you the training, but some of the certifications, the certificates are expensive. But if that's covered under SCSEP, that's great. We can bill back.
Well, I'll let the experts on my team respond to what is an allowable project cost, because we want to make sure that SCSEP is a jobs program and not a social service support experience. So I applaud your leadership, both in asking the question, but also trying to figure out how to best prepare your job seekers for what is to come. So I really appreciate the question.
Well, one challenge we find, and again, this is where SCSEP's the perfect match, is even when older adults are trained, there is some reluctance to hire them if they don't have experience. So we're trying to figure out how to get past that bridge, because we do see a lot of people in SCSEP who have training from various programs, but because they don't have experience, we do see with the older worker a little more hesitancy to hire somebody who's trained but not experienced. So, but again, SCSEP's that could potentially be that bridge if we can figure out how to cross it together.
Well, I thank you for that follow-up. This is what I will say, and I could be generalizing here, so forgive me for my indulgence. We are functioning in a very unusual time, and we can all accept that to be our reality, right? And in the unusual nature of our time, this is what I've seen. The desperation to get people hired and placed in jobs in many ways exceed the pre-existing bias that I've observed for a very long time. Case in point, I was driving through an area just north of Cleveland about 2 weekends ago. I could not tell you how many help wanted signs I saw. And these weren't help wanted signs strictly for warehousing and manufacturing. Some of these jobs were for administrative purposes. What we've seen in the last 2 years is a lot of Americans have opted out of the workforce. And employers are now willing to hire anybody, oftentimes, who is willing and able and enthusiastic and have the motivation to acquire the skills needed to perform certain tasks. So I'm actually, for this limited period in time, and we may go back to a different kind of environment, to the old ways pretty soon, but for this limited period in time, the sheer desperation I'm seeing among employers is something I've never experienced in this country in all my time here.
Gary, I think that's a great response and a great segue to some of the other questions that we've gotten, because you mentioned some of the opportunity you're seeing in the economy, but at the same time, some of the callers today are wondering, Barbara Freeman asked a question, and so did Susan Nicholson, that are related. They're wondering, what are some ways for older job seekers to combat ageism? Susan's wondering about how you get past the apply online, and Barbara's wondering how you can be told you have too much experience.
Yeah, that's actually I thought about this question because I knew it would come, because when technology and artificial intelligence through the online platforms have replaced people as the hiring manager, that's a problem. Earlier this year, I interviewed Ian Siegel, who is the CEO and chairman of ZipRecruiter. And I hope after this conversation, we can make available Ian Siegel's interview with me, where he spoke about this very issue. Because what he talked about is the use of language and how language can somehow denote who you are, ways to not use certain dates, because the dates will then denote how old you are, right? But there are certain things you can do and write on these application forms that neutralizes to the machine your identity, but it captures your qualities. And so, without being too specific, I don't want to give any misleading answers, I will make available the interview with Ian Siegel, because that was a treasure trove of information that any older person can use to help inform how they can get past these online platforms, because that issue is real. And AI and technology has become our new hiring managers. And those who are affected tend to be older people.
Great. And I would just add to what Gary indicated is the interview with Ian Siegel is a definitely must listen, because he includes things like make sure you have a current email account and make sure you take dates off your resume. So it's very concrete advice he gives, and it's excellent. So Gary, we have a caller who raised their hand. So we're going to open the phone. Lauren Taylor, you can ask your question now. Lauren, can you unmute yourself so we can hear your question? Let me see if I can unmute you.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay. Well, what would you like to say? The phone line's open.
I wanted to know, when do you plan on hiring in the project office? Would that be one of the things that would come into the future with hiring the case managers that's in the project office?
Lauren, which project office are you with?
I'm in Camp Spring.
Okay, so you're in Prince George's County?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, we can't speak on behalf of Prince George's County. We partner with the Department of Family Services there, but definitely if our partners have opportunities, they have a great track record of looking to our program Job Seekers First. So I would just say that maybe after this call, you talk with Diane James about what opportunities there might be. Okay. All right. Our next question, Gary, is from Robin Heidemann. It has to do, it's related to the digital literacy questions that keep coming up. And this one is from Robin. My issue is reentering the workforce. I have a 2-year degree, but no experience in my field. She joined the program to gain experience, and her issue is how employers train. She finds that all the training is on a computer, and she learns best the old-fashioned way on a projector screen or a board. And she's a very hands-on learner. Do you have any thoughts for Robin?
I'm probably in the same boat as you, Robin. I'm used to old school teaching, where you can engage with the instructor in a very real way. I think the reality is the world has changed, and it's changing in a way that makes all of us uncomfortable. And 2 years ago, the platform we are using today, Zoom, I had never heard of it. Yet I'm now very familiar with the tools that this platform is creating for us to communicate and engage. So all I can say is change is difficult. And we have to somehow do our best to adapt to it if we are to remain relevant. Because employers are going to be asking you questions about your comfort with certain kinds of technology and how you communicate through them. So your adaptation to technology will also inform how you respond to questions about its use. So that's one. I think two, going back to the digital certification program. Pre-pandemic, roughly 3% of American job seekers worked from home. 3%. Post-pandemic, that number increased to 53% of job seekers work from home. And much of that was because the job seekers essentially told their prospective employer that I would only consider working for you if I could work from home. And out of that came the sort of hybrid workforce model that many of us are now familiar with. So the reality is we have to acquire those skills. We have to adapt our training, our learning habits, because oftentimes the best instructors will not be present live in a room. They'll be on a screen. And change is hard. But the jobs that we're seeing coming through the statistical sort of data points suggest that technological proficiency, a hybrid workforce, knowing how to use technology is going to become how we visualize and how we adapt to and how we engage the future of work.
Great. Thank you for that question, and Gary for your response. Our next caller is, make sure I get this name right, is Bernie Lofton. Bernie, your phone line should be open now. Can you please ask your question? No, Bernie, you're on mute. Can you please unmute your phone, Bernie? There you go.
Is it done?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, you pretty much answered my question in the beginning when I first clicked on to raise my hand. But I was only wondering why the program only lasted only a few years for us older people. I know we need the training in order to go out on the workforce to better jobs. But when you're in your late 70s and you go out there and you're trying to get in the workforce and they're just not accepting you because of the training. You do offer a lot to us, and the SCSEP, I'm so happy to be in the program, but only working for a few years.
Yeah,
I
Bernice,
just want to know what is left for us after the few years are over.
that's a great question, and I thank you for making the call today, because it is important for us both on a moral, primarily on a moral side, to advocate for folks who are on the program. But the reality is, and I'll have to emphasize this, the reality is the period of time you are on the program is a legislative issue. It's written into law, not regulations. The law says up to so many months. So we can do nothing to change the law, because that would require an enormous amount of effort. And typically around these workforce and jobs program, it's almost impossible. So I have to be really candid with you. The second motivation is that by offering term limits to one's participation on the program, when one's time expires, it then allows somebody else onto the program, right? And it's important for us to make sure the program is as available to as many people as possible. But for those who are on the program, there is also a requirement, also written into law, by the way, that we increase the number of folks on the program who are transitioning into occupations that doesn't require any form of federal subsidy. So this would be like you, Miss Bernice, Miss Bernice? Miss Bernie, leaving the program and going to work for Andrews Air Force Base Credit Union as a teller or a customer service rep for $19, $20, $22 an hour. But the experience of working with people in your current role on the program has given you the confidence and the tools to perform in that role. So there is a requirement for the program to be term limited, but there's also another requirement that we do the best we can to give you the tools to move into jobs when your program term ends. I hope I've addressed the question.
Well, Bernie's no longer on. And the only thing I'd answer, Gary, in response to supplement your great answer is Congress decides the rules for the CSEP program every time the Older Americans Act is reauthorized. And it was Congress that decided to add a 4-year term limit to CSEP. So as Gary was saying, as a grantee, we have to follow the rules of the program. It's an opportunity to, we always try to let Congress know the pros and cons of things, but we're not an advocacy organization. And it was a rule that they set. So our next question, do we have any callers in the queue, Mate? If not, I'll take one of the other questions. We've had a lot of questions from attendees about partnerships. And in particular, what is the center doing to develop partnerships with national employers to prioritize hiring CSEP job seekers, or to commit to working with CSEP to hire our job seekers?
That's a great question. So about 2 weeks ago, I met with a professional staff on the Education and Labor Committee. And we discussed all things workforce development. And we talked about CSEP and the experiences of older workers. And he was very candid with me. CSEP is among the least supported program in Congress. is also among the programs running out of the Department of Labor. It's also the lowest funded, least supported, lowest funded. But for two reasons. We have not been successful in meeting one of its legislative priorities, which is to get people into jobs when their 4 years is up. We have not been successful. It starts with this office, but it trickles down through our sub-grantees. Because frankly, all hiring is local. And our sub-grantees have to own this. We have local chambers of commerce, local, regional workforce business networks. And what the law requires is for local organizations and workforce boards to have memorandum of understandings with employers. So the program it becomes a conveyor belt from training into jobs. And all of us have been negligent in making that a reality. And it's for that reason, and that reason alone, that the SCSEP program is not funded at the level of need. Because the Republicans, I've heard this too on the Hill, the Republicans will only support SCSEP receiving new levels of funding if they hear from their chamber of commerce that it's a good idea. They will go to their base. Met Gary Officer, great guy, came up here, made a good case, but what do you think about it? And the staffer told me that the Republicans will only ever support a program like SCSEP if they hear from the business community that this is a good idea. And from what I'm hearing today, it is a good idea. No, it's a great idea, because everyone who's made a call today about the program said, I want to work. I want to find a place where my skills match. I want to break through these platforms that basically eliminate my candidacy. So your enthusiasm is helpful. I can speak to that. It's incumbent on us and our partners to step up as best we can to engage our business community partners so we can move people into jobs. It's plain and simple.
Well, Gary, there was a great question in the queue or a suggestion rather that I'd want to get your reaction to from Tracy Carpenter. She asks, are there incentives that the federal government provides to organizations who hire older adults, kind of like they do with folks who've re-entered the community? If not, is that something that could be advocated for, especially since our population is aging and living much longer, as well as older relative caregivers were becoming more and more common for older job seekers to have a higher stable income?
That's a great question. And thank God I went on the Hill a few weeks ago because this question came up. So among in the business community, there was an effort to file legislation and for it to receive funding through appropriations for American, and it's pushed by the Chamber of Commerce, for employers to receive a federal either a grant or a federal training fund to support their hiring certain kinds of workers. So if I'm an employer and I hired you, I would get either a tax incentive or some form of federal assistance for hiring and then training you. And that came from the business community. The professional staffers and the Democrats said, no, we should not be paying you, a public company, to hire and train your workers when you're making such a huge profit in this environment. So that is something I heard on the Hill from the employer side. But it's going nowhere. So short answer to a great question.
It really is a good question. Our next caller in the queue is Danita Gill. Danita, your line is open. You may ask your question now. Oh, you're still on mute, Danita. Can you unmute, please? To unmute, you go to your left-hand screen and there's a microphone. There you go.
Unmuted?
Yes,
Hello?
we can hear you. We can hear you.
Hello. I would just like to know, what is your perspective on nonprofit organizations? How do they play into CSEP?
Well, the program is administered through nonprofits, so it plays a great role for CSEP. We receive $405 million a year from Congress as a program. The national organizations, I think, pick up about 85%, Chris, of the funding is allocated.
75 and 25 to the
So
states.
75% of the total $405 million that's appropriated through Congress is divided between 20 organizations, of which I think 15 are national organizations and 5 are what's called set-asides that are helping very specific organizations. We, unlike most of our national partners, work through a network of local nonprofit partners, because our nonprofit partners that we work with have the mission, have the motivation, and have the experience in working with the population that the program was intended to serve. So the nonprofit community is an absolutely essential part of the fabric of the CSEP program. But the nonprofit community, and I'll say this one more time, owes the program a major service by doing a lot better in speaking to the needs of the employers by having those relationships. And if we can get those relationships in place, it creates a much better argument for me to make before Congress that the program is driving significant local economic outcome. Thank you.
I think just to supplement what you said, Gary, is nonprofits are important to CSEP, as you noted, because many host our job seekers for their training, and many do hire the job seekers after a certain amount of training time. Now, not all. There were some comments in the Q&A about, how come my host agency didn't hire me? We can't really speak to that. That would be an individual situation, but a lot of nonprofits don't have a lot of resources right now to hire people, and they're working with CSEP to provide training opportunities to help accomplish their mission. So nonprofits are very important to us.
And if I can add to that, Chris, that's a very important point you made. Nonprofits, we're not Bank of America. We're not Wells Fargo. We don't have, an inordinate amount of resources that may fluctuate one way or the other, all right, year over year. But mostly in their case, it fluctuates up. Many of us are on a fixed budget that's informed by government contracts. And government contracts that year over year never increases. So with the best of intention, would love to bring people through the program and into our agencies. But the lack of elasticity in our budget doesn't afford that to be the case. And that's why we have to find allies outside of the program who are age friendly and will absorb you on the basis of your skills and your interest.
Great. Thank you, Gary. We have a call from a caller with no name, but the call is from area code 256. We'd like to open the line to you. The phone number is 256-393-0656. We're going to ask you to unmute and so you can ask your question. So if you're calling from area code 256, if you could please unmute your phone. Maybe they're in a spot where they can't get through, so we will move on, and if they call back in. And it looks like our next caller is Barbara Freeman. Barbara, your line is open. You may ask your question. Can you unmute yourself, Barbara, please? You're unmuted, Barbara, if you want to ask your question now. Barbara? Barbara, for some reason we can't hear you. You are unmuted, but for some reason we cannot hear you. So unfortunately, we're going to have to move to our next caller. Our next caller is Joyce Carter. Ms. Carter, can you unmute your phone, please? You just, if you're in Zoom, which looks like you are, you just go to the left-hand corner and there's a microphone and you just click on it. So there's no line on your microphone. There you go.
I didn't have a question. I'm not for sure why I got on.
Well, is there anything you'd like to say today?
No, I don't think so. I was listening more about the amount, or if they're going to increase the seniors.
That's a great question. So you're asking kind of, if I can paraphrase, what Congress is planning for funding for the program?
Yes,
Okay. Thank you for your question, Gary. I'll address that.
If I'm getting this right, so the president has asked for SCSEP to be funded at $405 million. If I'm, and I don't have my notes here, so I could be off. The Senate has 450.
It's the House. The Senate.
The House has $458 million.
Yes.
And the Senate has $410 million, I believe.
No, they have the same as the White House, 405.
405.
Yes.
Wow. So it's likely that in the next Congress, SCSEP will not receive any new amount of funding, because the House is now in Republican control. The Senate is funded at the level of the White House. So it's going to take a lot for us to see any increases over the next 2 years. That's my prediction.
Thank you. And thank you for your question.
Wow.
Our next caller.
That's a great question, because I'd forgotten why I hesitated was I had to measure my response to the midterms. And so our strategy for the next 2 years is going to have to be to build allies in the Senate, particularly in Maine. Great question. I appreciate it. It's got me thinking.
Our next question comes from the Q&A, and Sergio Hedera asks, recruiting government agencies as host agencies has been an issue. How can we get local, state, and federal agencies, or basically the government host agencies, to train and hire CSEP job seekers?
That's a tough one. Because also depends where you are. You can get we have a number of programs with the federal government, experience services programs, where we bring back older and retired federal workers back into their agencies. We have a relationship with the EPA, National Park Service, Wildlife, Fisheries and Wildlife, ag. And what we often find is that when you get you can have a relationship with the headquarters, but the hiring decision is conducted locally. So I can't speak to the hiring practices of agencies that function in the local community, because oftentimes that relationship is informed by the nonprofit, local nonprofit, and that regional or local federal agency office. So it's a localized decision. I want to again emphasize this again. As a national organization, we fundraise nationally, but programs are delivered locally. As I mentioned before, with the private corporations, I could have a number of partnerships with national companies. But if those hiring decisions are conducted locally, they will have to have relationships with you guys in your local communities through which the pathway into these opportunities can be procured.
Great. Gary, we have about 10 minutes left.
Yes.
Would you like to take one more question or two more? How many more questions in the time remaining?
I will take as many as people want to get.
Okay. And I do want to let everyone know that we have contact information for everyone who attended this webinar. And if you submitted a written question that wasn't addressed in Gary's responses, we will answer you. You will receive a reply from us.
But I do want to make sure we get that Ian Siegel interview out. It's really important for many people that are challenged with and have experienced age discrimination, and how we can somehow mitigate that on the basis of knowing how to bypass those impediments. Because I haven't heard many of you today on this call. I think I can say this with some degree of confidence. If you can get into the room with a hiring manager, based on what I've heard and what I've known about the program and the job seekers I've met, your chances of being employed in this environment is as strong as it hasn't been for many, many years. Because my Ohio experience again of 2 weeks ago, employers are looking for employees. And it doesn't have to be manufacturing or warehousing.
Great, thank you. Yes, and that's an important point. We will send a recording of today's webinar to all the attendees along with the link to the interview Gary conducted with Ian Siegel, who is the CEO of ZipRecruiter, which is an online recruitment platform where Ian told us all the great strategies for working with those applicant systems that are automated. So our next question is from caller Jamette Owens. Miss Owens, if you could unmute your line.
Oh, I've been on this workforce not the workforce, I've been working with SCSEP for quite a few years, and I've had jobs that I liked, some jobs I didn't like, right? And I think that it was not only that it was a nonprofit agency, but I think it has a lot to do with your criminal history. Because yeah, you feel good about you can go to work, but then you look at like for the future, the plan your future, you be like, man, I've done all these things. This place give me a chance to work. Now, what will happen to me when I get out of this program? When your time is up, and you still have all the same things that you had going on. The reason why you couldn't get a job in the first beginning, and I think that a lot of people maybe should look at that. And I wonder, how can they get help? How can you get help with looking at this? It's like bad credit,
So, Miss Owen, what kind of experiences are you referring to that may not have been resolved while you're on the program that may prevent you from getting the job when your program term ends? What kind of issues are you referring to?
Okay, for instance, I didn't. A lot of I had a lot of good positions, but a lot of positions I didn't want. But it was a way of making. I just had to make money. Then I had to go through the Social Security to get all of that, to get a ticket to work. And then when found out that I would need to go through Social Security to get the ticket to work, then I owe Social Security money. And then that makes a lot of people feel like, man, they ain't getting no money for Social Security. They working this job, and then it's like, if they haven't got the ticket to work, then they're gonna owe their Social Security. So it's a lot of things, and it was a lot. It's a whole lot.
Where do you live? What state?
In Minnesota. And I'm doing like a little bit of history about, man, a lot of things, like the nonprofit agencies, and I found out that they are really not as cool as they as we think they are. It's like a lot of ways that they crush the people.
I can't speak to the nonprofit that you are referring to. I'd be unfair for me to do so. But what I am interested in is the kind of barriers, weight of responsibility, conflicting income needs, that if I do this over here, I'm penalized over here.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Because those are legitimate questions, right?
Yeah.
And so you're offering me some of the other issues that may inform certain outcomes. So if I'm telling my folks, well, why is this number not moving? And the reality is it can't move at the pace you want it to move, because
right.
Ms. Owens told you what part of the problem is, right? It's conflicting requirements for different income streams. It's maybe not being able to be in one job too long, then be forced to change to another, so your time expands. There's a myriad of issues. So I really appreciate, as I try to decode what you said, I appreciate your call.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gary, we have about 2 minutes left. Did you want to leave our attendees with any final thoughts?
Yes, I'm looking at some of the questions that came in before, and many of those questions were broadly answered in addressed today. the Senior Community Service Employment Program is a critical program for the emerging largest single segment of the US workforce. By 2024, the largest segment of the US workforce will be Americans who are 50 and over. So demographic trends is forcing employers to confront the reality that they will not be able to survive competitively without engaging our nation's older workers. That's you. But to be fully engaged means you have to be prepared. And to be fully prepared, you have to be trained. And to be fully trained, you have to have the skills that employers are looking for. So the digital certification program, any efforts to get more technologically savvy through online training platforms, and Chris and my team will get back to the earlier question about what funds can be accessed to support that, if any. I can't guarantee the outcome, but I'm certainly interested in finding out. Because if I can find a federal agency that will fund and provide overlay funding that we could use to address that question, I will go looking for it. And that's why these calls are important. It triggers ideas for me that I could use to look at what may or may not exist in the funding community that can get us to the solutions. But SCSEP is important. And I need all of you to appreciate the importance of the program and continue to feed my staff and colleagues with information, experiences, flaws, positive experiences that I could use as a storyteller to speak the truth to workforce injustice. So thank you all very much for your participation in today's call. I really appreciate you. Have a great week.